Cops have read it. What was your biggest, I truly am sorry I have to arrest you moment, and why? I draw the blood for DWI arrests, so not a cop, but I was sitting in the assistant district attorney's office when an officer calls in, and he stated that he felt horrible arresting this lady for drunk driving, even though she was plastered, because she was at her boyfriend's house and they were all drinking, and the boyfriend's friend started trying to SA her, and her boyfriend did nothing about it. So she hit the friend in the head and got in her car and fled from danger. Another driver called her into 911 for swerving. The lady drove 3 miles and made it to a gas station where she was found trying to call her friends on her phone for help. He felt bad that he had to bring her in, but the ADA didn't accept any charges on her, and the officer took her to her friend's house. 2 other officers went back to the boyfriend's house, and they got arrested with existing warrants and the SA. Seeing that woman sitting in the jail for the few minutes she was there was heartbreaking. She was covered in scratches and her clothes were torn. I'm so glad they didn't charge her for fleeing being SA'd. Story 2. I called the cops on the room a few doors down from where I was staying. Sounded like someone was in there getting their ass beat. I see the woman run out of the room, mascara running down her beat-up face. I see the guy with blood all over his shirt. She runs to her car and takes off just as the cops were pulling up. As the cops were talking to the guy, she comes back. I assume to tell her side of the story and press charges or whatever. She does, and the guy gets arrested. But problem is, of course, they all just saw her pull up, and both her and the guy are drunk. She also gets arrested for drunk driving, and they tow her car. Cops told me they were drunk. She was a prostitute and he was a customer. They got into a physical altercation regarding payment. Needless to say, I never stayed at that hotel again. Story 3. I'm no longer a cop, but my first ever DUI arrest was a guy I went to a very small college with, and we graduated together. I knew his family, his dog's name, we were friends. He was weaving all over both lanes and running onto the shoulder on both sides of the road. He cried and begged me to just let him go and he'd walk home and that he was sorry. I've always wondered how this internal ethical dilemma plays out between cops that go out on a call, to arrest someone or to address a problem, and they come across someone that they know, or even worse in this case, someone that's your friend or family. Like, what do you do in that situation? Like, I'm sure you ultimately end up doing your job, but that's just got to be tough and awkward. Story 4. I'm not a cop, but I played one in a play in grade school. I was supposed to arrest someone after they confessed, but poor kid forgot his line, but I didn't. So it came off as I made up a burglary charge on the spot and hauled him off. I never felt more corrupt in my life. It haunts me to this day. Edit. Wow, my first gold. Thank you, kind folks, for all the positivity towards this comment, and I'm glad my little childhood story could bring a little bit of sunshine to such a dreary thread. Story 5. As a probation agent, I was supervising Tim, early 20s on probation for possession of narcotics. Tim lived in assisted living apartments due to severe mental health. Great person who just needed help learning more about his mental health. I received a report that Tim started to like one of the staff members, Stacy. She worked third shift at their main house and often handed out medication. I talked to Tim about healthy boundaries between client and staff. Well, fast forward a couple days. Tim checked himself in the hospital because he tried to make a few advances with Stacy, but it was denied. Stacy described it as scary, as she was working in the main house and he followed her in a room and shut the door. Another staff member intervened. She then proceeds to make a report about other behaviors, like he stares at her and tries to be around her. He was arrested and had a short-term jail hold, 4 days, and we placed a no contact. Fast forward a few weeks. I received another report from Stacy stating Tim continues to linger around the main building when she's there at night. The night before, she was on med duty and he went to pick up his medication. She asked him to leave multiple times, but he never did. He continued to try to make advances towards her. Finally, a staff member walked in and told him to leave, which he then left. She feels extremely unsafe. I issue a warrant and go to his apartment. I'm waiting for police to arrive and I ask him about that contact. He kept repeating, I shouldn't have listened to her. However, he wouldn't go into much depth. Police arrive and he goes to jail. I staff with my supervisor if we should revoke his probation, as Tim is engaging in stalking behavior. I was finishing up my investigation and Tim adamantly denied Stacy ever telling him to leave that night. Finally, he breaks down and says they've been having a relationship for the past few months. Sure crap, checked his Facebook account, and it's apparent they were dating. She assured him no one will find out. Arranging times to meet, extremely flirty and sexual messages were sent between them. The female dog Stacy told me he was stalking her so she wouldn't lose her job. She reported the gestures as unwanted because other staff members caught them together. I was pissed that he went to jail, let alone we almost proceeded with revocation. I felt awful and apologized for the time he spent in jail. This was reported to the supervisor, but the effing female dog didn't lose her job. Anyone else would have had their social work license revoked or faced criminal charges. She just kept on working there. The county moved Tim to a different program. Unfortunately, that's just the world that we live in. The woman is always going to get the benefit of the doubt in this situation, and rightfully so, because the bad cases outnumber the good by, 10 to 1. But, it just sucks in situations like this where it truly is the woman being manipulative and, trying to kind of screw somebody over, figuratively and literally. Story 6. I once got a call for domestic violence. Another officer and I park our cars halfway up the block, for safety reasons, and start walking up to the house when we're approached by a man. He tells us that we're there to arrest him, but he refuses to give a statement. He just says he's sorry. We put him in handcuffs pending the investigation, and I go inside. Short end is that Dad was drunk, didn't like the way son number 1 was talking to him, and started beating him. Mom tried to step in and got pushed down. Son number 2 tries to help, but Dad attacks him and chases him out of the house. Mom and son lock themselves in the bathroom, and daughter, who was frightened, runs to a neighbor's house. Mom and 2 sons agree on what happened, so it's an easy arrest. But inside the house, there was a door with a bunch of locks on it that piqued my curiosity. It was obviously used to lock someone inside. Mom and sons wouldn't tell me what it was for, so I asked Dad. He said that the door was their daughter's room. His sons would SA her at night, so they locked her in to protect her. He said son number 1 had been arrested for it, but he wasn't given any jail time, and a judge said it was okay as long as they locked the daughter in her room at night. He told me that when he drank, he would get angry at his sons, but felt guilty that he did. I didn't think he was lying, but no judge would let a little girl stay in the same house as her SA'er. I did some digging and found out the daughter reported being SA'd to a teacher. After son number 1's arrest, prosecutors and CPS dealt only with the mom, who was entirely uncooperative, and the case was eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. When I asked Dad about it, he said that he had a hard time dealing with it at the time and left everything up to his wife. CPS ended up doing an emergency removal on the daughter and another small child. I still had to arrest Dad for attacking his family, but I felt bad for it. I have no idea what happened to any of them after that. Story 7. It was Christmas Eve at a super fancy hotel downtown in my city. Lady drove her vehicle into a parking barrier and hotel security called it in. Got out there and she had her daughter in the car with her. Mom had recently bought her a Christmas puppy, a tiny little corgi. So anyways, I called for one of our DWI units to do the test because it's a felony for the child passenger. Mom fails and we have to handcuff her. She tried to run and my partner takes her to the ground as he falls, slipping all in front of the daughter and Christmas puppy. Mom goes to jail and I had to stay with the little girl until her aunt arrived. Learned Dad walked out on them earlier in the month and Mom was having a tough time dealing with it. Mom needed to go to jail. She was drunk, but I felt for her and her daughter. Story 8. Obligatory not a cop, but friends and I were in a popular haunted cemetery in the area at night to get creeped out or whatever. Came out of the woods and a forest preserve cop scared the crap out of us by standing near the entrance in the dark, then turning on a flashlight as we approached. He brought us to his car to give us all FP curfew violation tickets and a lecture about people getting mugged in there at night. He gets to one of my friends and as he puts in his license info, an alarm bell goes off. He quickly grabs my friend and puts him against the car and cuffs him. Turns out he had a warrant for missing court for a reckless driving ticket. FP cop was pissed our friend didn't tell him he had a warrant because A, the computer doesn't say what the warrant is for, or didn't at the time, so all they knew at first was that they have to quickly arrest someone who may or may not be dangerous, and B, if he knew there was a warrant, he wouldn't have run the license. They were just trying to keep kids out of the forest preserve at night, not arrest people for traffic court violations. Story 9. Friend of mine who's a cop woke me at 3 a.m. to tell me this story. I completely understand why. I would be bawling my eyes out at making an arrest he did. He was called in to deal with a domestic dispute and arrested the woman because she beat the ever-loving crap out of the man. He told me he probably had a broken nose and wouldn't be shocked if he had vision problems in one of his eyes for the rest of his life. My friend brought the woman in and she had some fresh marks as well, a couple cuts and a solid bruise on her arm. She also had a couple wounds that had clearly been there for a couple days, and a couple that looked like they had just healed. My friend thinks that the man was abusing her for the longest time, and she just snapped and defended herself. The thing is, my friend's mother was also abused by his father, so arresting who seemed to be the overall victim broke his heart. Story 10. Not a cop, but a paramedic. Had a patient that was driving on a freeway at 100 km per hour when she started having a seizure. A man also driving on the freeway noticed her slumped at the wheel, so he sped up, pulled in front of her, and then used his car to slow hers down. I rock up, assess and go to transport the lady to hospital. Cops rock up, as they do, and find the man had warrants out for his arrest. Slightly awkward, but we had to leave his car on the freeway and go off to the cells. Story 11. There is a couple that lived in my district that I knew from outside of work. I happen to know the man had cheated on his wife and was all around a smarmy bastard. The wife was a respected member of the community with a prominent job. The couple also had a young son and were members of the local church. One day, a domestic disturbance gets called out at their residence. Dude was being an ass and got into an argument with her. She gets frustrated enough that she punches him in the face and he calls 911. He says he doesn't want to press charges, just wants to separate everyone and keep the peace. Wife does what every good Christian is raised to do and tells the truth. Our state has a mandatory arrest law if probable cause is found for any domestic violence crime. Unfortunately, that meant we had to take this sweet, otherwise law-abiding lady to jail. At least the bad guys have the good sense to lie to us. Edit. Geez, people, I realized that this was a good lawful arrest, and that the wife in this case committed a crime. Also, mandatory arrests for DV crimes are a good thing. This situation was unique in that I knew the couple socially before, and knew the emotional abuse he was doling out. The point of the story is that it was difficult on an emotional level to have to arrest someone I knew with that kind of backstory. Story 12. Not a cop, also not me. This happened to some friends. My friend Jay is allergic to a lot of things, and accidentally ate something she was allergic to. Her parents called an ambulance, but it's a small town and it was already attending an accident, so they rushed her up to the hospital themselves. Her dad was driving and was speeding and somehow managed to get pulled over by the one cop that wasn't attending the accident. Thankfully, the officer realized pretty quickly what was going on. Apparently, he was surprised my friend's dad pulled over at all given the circumstances. He couldn't allow her parents to speed the rest of the way, so he put Jay and her mom in his car and rushed her to the hospital himself. Stayed there until he was sure she was okay. My friend's dad still got a ticket, but the cop also gave him some advice on how to dispute it, given it was an emergency. I believe in the end he got off. Story 13. I remember there was a case in which a soon-to-be dad was driving his wife, who was in labor, to the hospital. Cop puts on the lights, and dad doesn't stop. Cop follows him and finally gets him to pull over. Pulls the guy out of the car, puts him on the ground. The soon-to-be mom gets out of the car screaming in pain and probably fear. The cop keeps him on the ground and calls an ambulance for the mom. She's taken to the hospital and gives birth while dad is in jail. The couple tried to sue, but since there's no constitutional right to be present at your child's birth, they had no grounds. I was livid when I read about this story. Thought about it for days. It still haunts me. The absolute gall of that cop. He was just pissed the guy didn't stop and decided to stick it to him instead of allowing him to see his child's birth. He still could have given him a ticket, taken him to jail after the birth, etc. My heart truly hurt for him and his wife. I'm afraid I would have found any and every way to make that cop's life and job a living hell. Story 14. Not a cop, but a former host/translator for a cruise liner. Once had to translate for our security officer as he expelled a French gay couple from the ship for beating a German woman up for reserving chairs at an empty lounge. It had a sign telling people not to reserve seats. The one thing they don't tell you when you get hired as a translator, people get mad at you, not the guy who's giving the actual orders. I've never heard so much cursing in French as I did that day. Story 15. Just happened. Not sure how the guy ended up here, but he had no phone, no family to call. Wasn't welcome at the homeless shelter because he was caught drinking there. Very cold outside. Mental health evaluated him and kicked him free, saying they couldn't help. Didn't have any vouchers or money to stay at a hotel. He asked to go to jail. I warned him of trespassing at the police department for the next 24 hours. He refused to leave. Arrested for trespassing was the worst option. That sucks. I mean, honestly, I haven't ever thought of that even being a possibility. When you literally have nothing and nowhere else to go, that being locked up in prison is honestly a better option, because at least at that point you get a roof over your head and a couple meals a day and you're not in the cold. Man, that is just brutal. Moving on. Story 16. My godmother is a single mom of 4. ATT. Now she has 5. IDK how the F it happened, but someone called immigration on her. ICE shows up to arrest her. All of her kids have different dads, and who the F knew where any of them were? So CPS is called, and you have mom being led away by ICE, and the 4 kids being dragged away by CPS. The youngest was 6. Story 17. Not a cop. When I was 14, my dad was driving me home from a marching band performance. Cops pull us over. My dad has an unpaid ticket of some kind, and they need to take him in. I'm adorably confused in a too large band uniform, holding a flute. My mom was 5 minutes away, and I got probably 3 apologies in at the time period as I waited to be picked up. Story 18. I'm a cop, but this one isn't my story. It's a buddy of mine. Woman calls 911 from hospital. Says she's been SA'd in our jurisdiction and was at the hospital awaiting a SA kit. Officer responds and begins preliminary investigation. He'd been talking to this woman for a couple hours when dispatch raised him on the radio. The dispatcher decided it was a good idea to run a warrant check on the woman and discovered she was wanted through Kentucky, not the state we worked in, with full extradition, meaning if she were found in any state in the country, the state of Kentucky wanted her shipped back to face their charges. I don't recall what it actually was that she was wanted for, but it wasn't for anything I'd consider major enough to warrant full extradition. At that point, the officer didn't really have a choice taking her into custody. It was done so obviously after being treated and released from the hospital, but nonetheless, that was a crappy moment despite the magnitude of whatever she did in Kentucky. Story 19. My mother told me about a case she had. She didn't make the arrest, but was the investigator. So basically, the woman was stalked by her ex and constantly harassed. She tried to go to the police about it 17 times, with proof and everything that they didn't do crap. So she and her friends kidnapped him, beat him up, and threw him naked in a ditch. Story 20. I've heard a story from a police officer in Australia where medicinal marijuana was not legal yet, having to arrest somebody for supplying marijuana oil to kids with cancer and severe epilepsy. There was a news article stating they felt like total pieces of crap because the guy they raided was a decent person trying to help a family friend with crippling illness and not actually selling the stuff to druggies. Even though it's legal now, it's so tremendously difficult to get. People still need to find other avenues to obtain it. Story 21. I've told this story here before, but I used to live with a cop. She was called to a shoplifting incident and found a young, totally emaciated-looking boy, couldn't have been older than 12, who the shopkeeper had pinched stealing some bare essential, a loaf of bread or a can of beans or something. She and her partner did everything they could to talk him out of pressing charges on the kid, but the shopkeeper insisted, and unfortunately her partner that day happened to be a superior or something, and whether or not to follow through with the arrest was out of her hands. She had to take this crying, scared, starving boy to juvenile prison with teenagers who had committed real crimes. She did everything she could to ensure he got immediate social services attention and lobbied to keep the charges from appearing on his record at all. But she still felt broken having to do that to a kid who needed help. Story 22. I got a call to a barber shop at like 4 a.m. for a woman outside who wanted her boyfriend, who she stated was on the inside, to give her her house key back. She initially told me that she had no way to get into her house because her boyfriend, now ex, had the key and so she needed it back. She also decided it was a good time to tell me she had a felony warrant. I ran him and sure enough, he had one. I felt bad for her, so I started to pound on the front door of this barber shop. I knew he probably wasn't going to answer, so I yelled something about if he didn't open up, I would report the barber shop to our problem properties unit for having someone sleeping overnight in the business. Sure enough, he comes to the door and opens it up. I immediately recognize him as a janitor at one of the grocery stores I frequented while working midnights, as it was the only thing open to get food. He was always really cool with me and seemed like a really hardworking guy. He explains to me he has no key of hers and the only reason she's there is because she knows he has a warrant and she just wants him to go to jail. He said he planned on turning himself in soon, but just wanted to get some things straightened out first with his kids. Unfortunately, I had already run his information on my car computer, so I had no choice but to arrest him for the warrant. I felt so terrible, but he was very understanding. I sit him in my patrol car, and while another officer watches him, I go and speak with her again. I tell her I wasn't able to get a key, so she would have to find another way to get inside the house. She tells me that's okay, she has a spare key. I ask her for her information now and go run her, and I'm praying to whatever God is out there that she also has any type of warrant, as I was going to arrest her too. But she does not, and she gets to go on her merry way. On the way down to intake, I asked the guy why he had come to the door. Said it was his friend's barbershop and he didn't want him to get in trouble over his drama. I felt so bad because I had to tell him I was just bluffing and none of that would have happened. Still feel terrible to this day. Story 23. Not a cop, but a prosecutor. I was in law school working as a prosecutor for my summer job under the supervision of an assistant DA. I'm getting ready for my first trial of the summer. It's a fairly bad one. This guy was drunk and lit a random car on fire. The fire spread to the house because it was under a connected structure. An elderly man was inside and barely escaped and is messed up from smoke inhalation. So it's my first week in the office, but my second summer, so I'm comfortable just stepping in and doing the work. My job is going to be jury selection and nothing else to get me back in the groove. In walks the defendant through the jail door into the courtroom, shackled at the wrists and ankle. I instantly recognize him. It's a guy who I used to work with / had some classes with who was constantly trying to convince my college girlfriend to date him instead of me. I told my boss I needed to recuse myself from the case, but I stuck around and watched him get convicted. Ended up talking my boss into a lighter sentence recommendation, though, by vouching for his character / potential before he became an alcoholic. Ended up recommending and getting jail time plus rehab. I assume he's out by now. Story 24. Not a cop, but the story fits. I was doing volunteer work with disadvantaged children in the community. It was basically an after-school program for kids who were from broken families and needed a supportive place to be. In talking with the supervisor, she explained how rough it is for some of the kids. On graduation day, most of the kids' parents will actually show up. The police know this and show up as well and use it as an opportunity to arrest any parents with outstanding warrants. So you're a 9-year-old whose parents are never in your life because they're deadbeats. It's supposed to be a happy day and mom and dad are actually there, but then they get hauled off in handcuffs. Just sucks all around. Story 25. Not a cop, but I was arrested for revenge adult films after my abusive ex-boyfriend made a false complaint. I had to wait 7 hours in a cell before I was told there was no evidence, and another 2 before they let me go. As I was being let out, the officer accompanying me said she recommended I file a complaint or sue them, as there was no reason for them to have arrested me at all. Story 26. Obligatory, not a cop, but I'm a 911 dispatcher. Took a call from a woman who was yelling and screaming, "Get away from me!" Hear a male in the background, and she is hardly answering us. Through GPS, we get a location, get a couple officers headed that way, then she starts to talk to us. Long story short, her boyfriend was harassing her, stalking her. She didn't say he hit me or anything, but he was being really aggressive with her, and she was just trying to get him to leave her alone. Guy ended up running away before officers got to her, and they never found him. But they did find out that she had a warrant for her arrest for failure to appear for some previous charges, so she gets arrested. Like, that's a real crappy day. Getting hassled by your dickhead boyfriend, then call for help, then you get arrested and he's free? Story 27. One time I was about 15 years old. I live in Canada, and we were all at a bush party. So it was probably around 12 at night, and I was just kind of lying on the ground, not that drunk. So anyways, the cops roll up, and they're usually pretty chill in my area about these things, because they happen so often. Anyways, the cop came over to me and asked me to walk in a straight line. I was fine, and I knew I could walk fine. So I proceeded to walk in a straight line, completely tripped over a rock, smashed my face on the ground, and the cop then said, "I'm sorry, buddy, but I'm gonna have to take you to the drunk tank." Anyways, I got a ride with him and talked him out of taking me to the drunk tank, and he drove me home. My parents were pissed about my mouth bleeding all over the carpet, and that's it. How do you just talk a cop out of taking you to the supposed drunk tank? Are things really that different? I mean, I live in the States, so are things really that different in Canada where you can just schmooze your way out of an arrest? What the heck? Story 28. Though the majority of cops I've met in real life, lived in our neighborhood, were not nice people. One even quit because they ostracized him when they found out he wouldn't lie to keep his buddies from getting into trouble. The rest all acted above the law, didn't follow neighborhood rules. One got caught stealing from parking meters, so he got paid to leave and they just switched where he worked. His son got out of 3 different DUIs. One time, he ran from a DUI accident in the snow with no shoes on. He hit a light pole and totaled his car. His dad covered it up for him. I think they reported the car stolen and fudged the time it was reported stolen for much earlier. Story 29. Not the cop in the scenario, but he said those exact words. I had a seatbelt ticket from 2 to 3 years ago that I'd forgotten to pay and never received a summons for. So one day, my car gets broken into. There's glass on the seat, laptop and backpack are gone, all that mess. The cop who shows up on the scene writes a report, takes some fingerprints, and asks me if I used to live in one town over. I say, yeah, back when I was fresh out of college. Why? He says, their police department has a warrant for your arrest. I'm really sorry. You've obviously just had an awful day, but I have to cuff you. So I spent a day and night in jail. My car sat there still unsecured, and they never found the burglar or my stuff. Story 30. I did a lot of crav with a lot of cops. Heard some stories. The one that upset one of my mates the most involved the essay of a child. There's a place in the western suburbs of Sydney, Australia, called Blacktown, where mostly African immigrants and Filipinos live. He got a call about a fight between a Sudanese teenage boy and a Sudanese man. The man called the police because the boy, quote, went crazy and started attacking him. When he defended himself, the boy got an improvised hand weapon and hit him. The man barricaded himself in a bedroom and called for help. Get to the house, grab the teen, and they think it's weird he's still there and didn't run. Teen says the man was essaying a little African girl who was the child of some tribal community relationship, and he wasn't putting up with it. Kid was arrested and charged with a dozen things. The cop telling the story grew up straddling the line between poor and middle class in a Lebanese diaspora. Having to arrest someone knowing his life is going to be destroyed for doing the right thing still doesn't sit well with him. Even telling that story at the gym, people were saying he should have planted a kitchen knife and just shot the guy. Everybody has a threshold for horror before a glass the country becomes an acceptable thought process, and cops are exposed to the worst society has to offer on the regular. Side note, the story doesn't have a happy ending. One of the cops asked the little girl who was in the house and displayed signs of trauma if there was any truth. She bawled and hid in the cop car. One of the cops beat some next-level dog crap out of the creeper and then got suspended for an extended period without pay for police brutality. Docs, equivalent to CPS, tore up the remaining family for not being able to provide/protect the child. Don't know what happened to the creeper, but I hope he's pissing into a bag for the rest of his life. Story 31. Years ago, I pulled a car over for extreme lane travel. The vehicle was wandering into oncoming traffic, and then it would go clear across the road and into the ditch, then back again. When I got the rig stopped, I found the driver to be an active-duty Marine on his first night back from a tour in Iraq. That was by far the hardest arrest of my career. I actually sat in my patrol car for over 10 minutes fighting with myself, but in the end, I had to go with a promise that I'd made to myself that I would never let a DUI go. I'd cleaned up the results of drinking and driving too many times. But I will admit to you that this rough and tough cop had tears in his eyes as I took the man into custody. Story 32. Former cop. Me and my partner respond to a DV call. A man called saying he was having an argument with his girlfriend and she hit him. Nothing too wild. We park and walk up to the house. Man and woman are outside just chilling, obviously not fighting anymore. Before I can say anything, this girl walks straight up to me and says, "Yeah, I hit him, but..." Then she launches into telling me about how they'd been dating for over a year, and she just found out a few days ago that he was married with kids the whole time. He was just there to pick up his things today and leave. He then said something really insensitive, so she slapped him. Just once and not hard enough to leave a mark. Unfortunately, the way laws and policies are written in my state, that's an automatic trip to jail for the night. I called my supervisor to see if there was a way out of it, but he told me no. So this already heartbroken girl who was trying to put herself through college had to go to jail because of that a-hole. I tried to be as nice as I could, but I felt like such an a-hole myself. That was one of many reasons I ended up leaving. Story 34. Not an officer, but my brother got arrested. He has a mental disability that prevents him from thinking about action/consequence, and he more or less only thinks about the present. He has no way of planning things out unless you tell him exactly what to do. He also has problems with being violent when off his meds. So we make sure he doesn't miss a day, and he hasn't missed a single day in 20 years. Well, there was a girl he liked, and he did his standard creepy thing of following her around the store she worked at, and then he asked her if they sell any weights for working out. Our mom wanted some, but didn't know how much they run. The girl was creeped out and yelled at him to F off, so he left. He went to work, then came home. Next day, he goes off to work, and the second he gets there, his boss fires him, and he gets arrested. The girl claimed he was stalking her for weeks, that he waited by her car, and when she finished her shift, he pinned her against her car and tried to SA her. His boss heard this and fired him, even though it didn't happen in the store. Not even same company or town. Considering my brother has had a history with violence, and he has had run-ins in the past with the police, he was going to get locked up in an asylum for the rest of his life. Just before the court case came up, the girl felt bad and said she was lying about the entire thing. Everyone who knew my brother knew he wasn't capable of waiting by her car. All the charges against him were dropped. However, the store owner was very adamant about not giving his job back, even though he worked there for 8 years, and loved bragging about how the store is the best in the world. He loved that job more than anything. He got a new job about a year later, but he was very depressed for like 8 months after losing his other job. Story 35. Felony marijuana arrest that I assisted on. The guy had stomach cancer, so it was next to impossible for him to eat without using THC. Otherwise, he would be extremely sick. Unfortunately, possession of THC concentrates is an automatic felony in my state. We took the THC products, but we were able to bond him out rather than take him to jail. He was on vacation with his family at the time. Very understanding guy, and I felt horrible during and after. Story 36. I used to work the side of town that the mall and the Walmart were on. Walmart is basically the mecca for shoplifting, and I'd spend a lot of my time on day shifts basically picking up loss prevention apprehensions. It was a fairly rare occurrence, surprisingly, that a shoplifter was ever a person in need, usually just people stealing crap because they can. Got called one day to a woman in her 20s in LP custody. She'd stolen a pair of swim trunks and sunscreen. She had a little boy with her and said she didn't have any money and just wanted to get him those things so he could go to a classmate's swim party that he's been invited to. Broke my effing heart for both her and her kid having to witness it. I offered to pay, but LP said they couldn't accept, and for liability reasons, if they'd done an app, they had to prosecute. Not sure if that's true or not, but damn, I felt effing terrible. Story 37. Former immigration officer. We had a guy come in thinking he was doing his final interview for citizenship. Well, turns out he was knowingly using a stolen identity to sneak off back to Egypt because he had a second family there. He brought his other family with him that day. I had to order him arrested in front of his 4 kids. You see, knowingly using a stolen identity to defraud the government carries a mandatory 2-year federal prison sentence, so he was going to do time, then get his lying ass deported. The problem was that he had brought his family over on IR visas, and his wife, the mother of these kids, had 0 education, spoke 0 English, and had worked 0 hours while in the States, which means she had 0 chance of maintaining her or her kids' permanent resident status. Now, these kids were in their early to late teens and had spent 7 years, the formative ones, growing up in America. They were fully Americanized, but since they legally entered the US, they didn't qualify for dreamer status. And since the oldest was just shy of applying for college, they couldn't adjust to a student visa. So, because of their piece of crap father, I had to essentially deport an entire family of decent people. I really hope he gets S8 in prison for what he did to his family. Story 38. Was MP on a Marine Corps base, actual location withheld, and got a call about an alcohol-related disturbance at the barracks. I figured it was the same old crap about drunk Marines getting into a fight. Pulled into the parking lot to find an older woman, pretty well dressed, going berserk on a female Marine and a male Marine. Both Marines were still in uniform, so I could tell the ranks. PFC female, First Sergeant male. Everyone was drunk. Turns out this lady was the wife of the First Sergeant, and she caught wind of him cheating on her with the PFC. Confronted them at the barracks after they both admitted to the affair. The worst part of this was the First Sergeant was an old sergeant of mine from a different unit before ILAT moved to 5811. The woman was escorted off base and we had to arrest the 2 Marines. Story 39. My wife was a teacher in an inner-city school. Back in 2015, a fight broke out in her kindergarten classroom. She called for security and stepped in between the kids. As she did, she put her hand on their chests, as one does when they're holding people apart. The instigator goes to the principal's office, gets reprimanded, and sent back to the classroom that same hour. Same kid gets into a fight on the way home, gets a black eye, gets his shirt torn, and so on. Tells his mom about the fight at school. She calls a lawyer. Long story short, my wife gets charged with assault. It's worth mentioning here that the DA made repeated racial statements about my wife needing to, quote, work with her own kind. BS to that effect. Anyway, weeks go by. My wife is home on administrative leave. Can't have her in the classroom while the investigation is going, which I suppose I understand. I'm at the gym at like 6 a.m. She calls me to tell me she's being arrested. I dash home, and sure enough, 2 squad cars are at my house. When I start to walk up the sidewalk, the officer in charge pulled me aside and apologized for having to arrest her. He said someone is pushing the case hard, and he had explicit orders to serve the warrant at her home. Out of consideration for our 2 kids, he wouldn't cuff her until she was outside. And that was that. She got arrested that morning, spent the whole day at county, and was released around 2 a.m. I spent the whole day on the phone with her lawyers. It's a much longer story, but that's the arrest part. Update. She had to surrender her teaching license, but the criminal charges were dropped. The DA did clarify the rules about teachers making physical contact with students. The correct course of action would have been for her to watch the kids beat each other until security arrived. Maryland later amended the policies for this type of thing. The kid who started the fight wound up stabbing a cop. He was with his brother when the brother shot someone, and the kid was taken to the station as a witness. While there, he took a pencil and stabbed a cop in the neck. He's in state custody, as far as I know. The mom had also sued the school for allowing the assault to happen. She settled for an undisclosed amount. Rumor has it that it was mid-6 figures. My wife finished her PhD, graduating in 2016. She works as the office manager at a dental office and is turning her thesis into a book about how our brain processes written symbols into language. Basically, how people learn to read and how to teach reading to people whose brains process language in different ways. It's pretty nerdy stuff that I don't completely understand. Story 40. My brother is an officer, and I know his most traumatizing moment. It wasn't an arrest, though. There was a single mom with 14 kids under 16. She just had another baby, and it was deemed she did not have the ability to care for another child. Single mom, not a single dad helping, small house considering number of kids living there. She obviously refused to give up her baby, so police had to accompany social workers to take the child. My brother said it was awful being surrounded by all the kids crying, screaming, begging for the child not to be taken, and a mom who clearly loved her baby but couldn't cope and was sobbing too. I know he felt bad, and still does now, but he had to do his job, and it was in the best interests of the baby. That affected him more than countless other incidents he's encountered. Story 41. When I was first starting out on patrol, I was driving my lieutenant, NYC. We got called to a dispute. A lady let her dog stop to pee on the curb in front of a residence. The homeowner and his family didn't want that because in the hot summer heat, it made the whole patio smell like piss. He went and yanked the leash, causing the dog to yelp in pain. Might have caused a scratch too, but I can't remember too well. She called 911 because he hurt her dog. It obviously wasn't animal cruelty, but since dogs are property, it's criminal mischief for damaging property. The woman wanted him arrested. The man had a nonverbal autistic daughter around age 10, and no one to care for her because his parents, her grandparents, didn't understand how to deal with an autistic child. We were pleading with her not to press charges, but she just wouldn't budge, even while his daughter was freaking out and crying. We told the man we'd have to arrest him because she was pressing charges, but he was eligible for DAT and we'd get him out as soon as possible. He understood and was totally reasonable about it. We let him calm his daughter, hug her, and tell her he'd be right back. We handcuffed him out of sight of his daughter. The female dog complainant watched him saying bye to his daughter, completely unfazed. My lieutenant made somebody with a lot more time do the arrest, and had him out within 2 hours on a DAT, but it all still sucked for all of us. Story 42. I work in a big city in Southern California. One day, I was flagged down by a traffic enforcement officer stating he was impounding a vehicle. He ran the plate and the vehicle returned as a stolen car. As he was impounding it, a woman ran out of the apartment complex and entered the vehicle. The woman was last seen driving northbound. I'm driving around looking for the vehicle and eventually I find it rolling. The driver pulls over on her own and she gets out. She yells, "I know it's stolen." I then prone her out on the ground because it's a high-risk felony stop. We take her into custody, and I read her Miranda rights to her. She told me she had stage 4 cancer, and she stole the car to go to her chemotherapy appointments downtown. I felt like crap, but I'm bound by law to arrest for every felony. About a month later, I was told by detectives she passed away from the cancer in jail. This was about a year ago, and I still get crap from my partner and whole station for it to this day. Story 43. Not a cop, but my mom was arrested for a bounce check. My mom is 4 feet 11 inches, a little powder puff, really. The bounce check was for $2 and change to the library for an overdue book. The library took like 2 months to cash it, so my mom forgot and closed the account. A couple years later, this cop showed up to arrest my mom, and you could tell he felt really bad. He didn't want to do it, but there had been a warrant issued and he was there to collect. Crappy situation, but I can't be the only one thinking, who the heck writes a check for $2? Just pull some cash out and be done with it. What in the world? Story 44. My husband's was a 12-year-old girl. Stole her grandmother's car. Felony car theft, and then she gave chase. She never left the neighborhood they were in, which he thought was weird. Finally, he pitted her. As he got out, he pulled her out of the car, and as his face saw hers, he was like, "This is a kid." She said she was 12 and she was running away because they didn't have food. Kid's story checks out. Warrant later shows the house was crawling in drugs, but not food. Her grandmother, whose car she had stolen, presses charges. He figured out that the reason the girl didn't leave city limits or hit the interstate was because she simply didn't know the way. He came home with tears. Story 45. I'm a cop in the USAF, and this is pretty short. I was at the gate one day and scanned a guy's ID card. It popped up red, saying he's considered dangerous and violent and detain immediately. I do the same and put him in the back of the gate shack and call it in. While I was waiting for the call back, I was talking to him to see what it could have been. It could have been a false hit, something they forgot to take out of the system, anything really. He honestly didn't know. The callback states it was indeed him, verified by his DL number and other information we have on file, because he's also in the military. Turns out he was wanted for aggravated assault from the previous weekend. I honestly think he was so drunk he blacked out and beat the crap out of someone, then got back home and didn't realize he did anything of the sort and didn't get picked up until he was on his way to work that Monday. He was very compliant and confused as to why we had him in cuffs, and I honestly think he got it sorted out and the victim is okay. Story 46. I once had to arrest a homeless man for public intoxication. I hated having to do it. I had previous experience with him, however, and I know when he gets drunk, he can barely walk. He will fall and bust his face up on the sidewalk. So, of course, if he's walking down the side of the road and takes a wrong step, he could very likely fall out into traffic. I really didn't want to arrest him because I knew he wouldn't be able to afford the fines associated with the charge, but I didn't have much of a choice. I couldn't just leave him out on the street to wander off. I got him transported to the hospital first in the hopes that they would just keep him overnight, but they just cleared him. His blood alcohol content was a 3.8, so once they medically cleared him, I had to hook him up and take him to jail. The worst part is that he's a super friendly guy. Story 47. Not a cop or the arrestee. Great way to start, eh? Anyways, Mom got arrested. Christmas Eve 2017. She had found out her boyfriend, who she's still effing, with like, come on, dump his female dog ass already, woman, had cheated with his ex from like 20 years ago. She pushed him down the stairs. Well, Sparta kicked him in the effing spine, down the stairs. It was 1 a.m. Christmas Eve and she spent the day in jail. Edit. Yes, the cop pretty much apologized for having to arrest her. Story 48. Not a cop, but something I saw. Two people drinking alcohol at the beach decide to sit right at the edge of the sand next to the footpath rather than closer to the water. A police officer walking on the path sees them and issues a ticket. They were like, seriously? And he said he was obligated to issue the ticket. If they had just sat somewhere not in his direct line of sight and walking path, he could have let it go. Story 49. Obligatory not a cop. My friend saw a guy drive past a teenage girl, stop, get out of the car, and try to drag her in it, while screaming like hell for help and that she didn't know the guy. Friend tackles the man and saves her. He didn't stop there and proceeded to beat the crap out of the dude and actually hospitalized him, and surprise, surprise, the guy pressed charges. The officers dealing with the case actually apologized to my friend for having to do this. They all said he went too far, but commended him for saving the girl. Story 50. The police department came down and told me I have to arrest 5 black guys that night, or I would be written up. After some hard searching, I found 2 black guys I could charge something with. Drugs. I found a 3rd black guy, pub intox. The other 2 I had to arrest for disturbing the peace, or I would get into trouble at my job. I felt a little bad about that. Okay, here's an idea. If your employer is encouraging you to be racist, maybe give them the middle finger and quit. That's horrible. That's absolutely horrible. Moving on. Story 51. Grew up in a fairly wealthy, quiet, very law-abiding family. As a kid of 16 to 18, I was a jerk and collected a load of parking tickets. I left my hometown at age 19 for a distant city, but the day before I started my trip, my mother made me go to the police station with her to pay all my parking tickets. We double-checked, made the cop go through the system to make sure all tickets were paid. Mom was a stickler. I paid what there was, and the cop gave us the all clear. I'm gone from town for about 9 months. Come back for Christmas on December 24th. Having family time in the living room around the tree, 4 p.m. Cop knocks on the door, asks for me, saying they have a warrant for unpaid parking tickets. One of them threatens to cuff me at the front door. He didn't, but still gripped my shoulder and arm like I'm a violent threat and escorts me to the backseat of the police car, taking me to the station. Mom was saying we checked. The cop said 2 tickets must have still been so new they didn't show up when we went 9 months ago. Mom's crying. Dad, interestingly, is quietly raging. My always calm professional father has a look that I've never seen before. He tailgated that cop the whole way to the police station with Mom, had her tell what happened 9 months before, pays the total bill, and gave those cops a barely restrained description of what particular kind of unprofessional, untamed, irresponsible horse crap their brains were filled with. It was glorious. My dad isn't huge, he isn't scary in any way, but I saw him swear and demean 3 or 4 officers who could not look him in the eye as he ranted at them. F those late 80s moose jaw cops. Story 52. So I've been to jail a couple times, but my town has a pretty big homeless problem. There are a lot of shelters and everything, but it's just not enough sometimes. I don't even know how many people I was locked up with who had a similar story. No family, no place to stay, no food, no reason for mental hold, and all they want is 3 hots and a cot. So they will trespass or go commit petty theft and intentionally get caught. Just little things that they would rather have on their record than go another night starving in the cold. Some of the saddest crap I've seen. Story 53. I had a patient come in the other day who had delivered at home. She didn't speak English or Spanish even. She was from the hills of Guatemala. I think Chuj was her native language. Anyway, she delivered at home, thought something was wrong with the baby, and she didn't know how to resuscitate the baby. I doubt most people do. And she didn't know how to call an ambulance. So she calls several different friends until a friend of a friend calls the ambulance for her. Baby turned out fine. Was a little cold when she got to the hospital, but everyone was okay. Social services takes her kid. So having a baby isn't a big enough emergency to rush to the hospital, but not rushing to the hospital can get your kid taken away? These people in authority positions really grind my gears sometimes. Story 54. I was an intern at the municipal DUI course they ran. Every class had at least one person that shouldn't have been there, as in they got no value and the course had no relevance. One lady was 77, had the flu, and had taken NyQuil before getting a call from her grandson he needed to be picked up at night. Stupid decision, but also not intentionally neglectful. No alcohol, still a DUI for going slow at night. It's quite expensive to fight, and many people in these situations just plead guilty because they don't have $6,000 for a shark attorney. It's easy to get self-righteous and foam at the mouth, but that doesn't make one a good person, or contribute much. It's low-effort morality theater. Also, frankly, the hang them all attitude has resulted in more than a few cases of medically impaired people being harmed because an officer thought diabetic shock was drunkenness. One poor guy was punched repeatedly for belligerence by an arresting officer who thought he was drunk when he crashed. Same thing with strokes. Innocent people have been left for hours, sometimes days untreated, causing worse brain damage because idiots think they're drunk and don't bother to follow procedures because F them. It's that kind of self-serving, hot-headed indignation that winds up making society worse. Also, stop before writing anything about me somehow saying DUI is okay. I've made this statement before and had people with no better argument simply try to straw man some nonsense about whitewashing DUI. If that's your response, just please. No. Story 55. There was this truck driver a few weeks ago who flipped his big rig. Dude was like 68 or 69. Either way, nice enough working dude. Just got into an accident, you know? Someone ran his name, and he had a Class A warrant that was like 23 years old. He lied to some police a couple decades ago about some bullcrap, but nonetheless, he had a warrant. It was active, out of our county, and he just happened to crash here. He doesn't even live here anymore. Lives like 4 hours away. Either way, the warrant was active and I had to book him. I called every supervisor I could to get permission to ignore it, but ultimately it was an active warrant and they wanted him arrested. I genuinely felt bad. He was cool about it though, even laughed. Took him a bit to remember exactly what happened. Nonetheless, yes, I felt terrible booking him. While he was at the hospital, he was first telling me he had no clue what the warrant was for. He said he knows he was arrested in the late 90s over his ex-wife, but other than that, he'd never been arrested. I saw in his record that was true, and his case was dropped, but he couldn't remember any other time the police were involved in his life. The warrant itself isn't attached to the report or anything. It just says wanted, and it has the original charge, so there's no real clarification. His charge was for a false report to a PO, which is a Class B misdemeanor, but somehow his enhanced to a Class A. After a while, he said, "Oh, crap. It must be that time my brother got into a fight. I didn't get arrested, but the police were questioning me." So the only thing we could gather is that his brother beat someone's ass, but he misled the police or lied to them about what happened. But he couldn't really remember the details of his interaction with the cops, just that they spoke to him. Other than that, in his one arrest in the late 90s, there was nothing on his record. It was weird, too, that he was arrested in like 97 or 98, but his warrant wasn't issued till 2000. Also, when he was arrested, he was only in jail for a few hours, which made us think this warrant had absolutely nothing to do with his arrest for slapping his wife. I'm sure he got to jail, seen a judge within 15 hours, and got released, but I never followed up with it. Story 57. Not trying to get you to spill on the guy what the warrant was for, but reading how long ago you said it happened made me wonder, and I hope this isn't a stupid question, sorry if so, if there are as many things outside of negligently causing a death, whether murder, manslaughter, whatever else criminal, that have no statute of limitations? Not saying I'm assuming he somehow killed someone, but like I said, your comment made me curious. Then story 58. Yeah, for sure. Made an arrest one day of someone with a suspended DL, no insurance, and FTA warrant. Became obvious on the ride to jail that the individual obviously had a development disability and didn't necessarily have the capabilities or oversight to properly pay his fine or bills. Regardless of what some folks say, there are people who fall through the cracks. It's a part of our jobs, in my opinion anyway, to educate while enforcing. Printed off some resources for him to set up his payments on autodraft. Most of the times, though, I feel more sorry for the family members affected by their loved one being arrested, especially if the suspect is a provider or caregiver. It's sad that they put being involved in felony illegal activity over caregiving to a loved one. I try to do as much as possible to go behind where I can and assist the family with anything that can be done. Story 59. In certain situations, mental disabilities are a big one. They may not know right or wrong, but that's not for me to decide. Sometimes people just get the short end of the stick. I've arrested addicts that have been clean for a year because they had a warrant from when they were messed up. Obviously, they've made a big effort to change their life, and it doesn't feel good putting a wrinkle in their plan. Story 60. I had this old man in his 70s. Guy could barely walk or talk, and his scooter got stuck in the middle of the road. I ended up having an ambulance check him out, and they decided to bring him to the hospital, but they couldn't take the scooter. I ended up having to tag his scooter for safekeeping at our property room. While I'm pulling up his info, the guy popped up to have a failure to appear in court warrant from some years back. We ended up having to get the guy cared for in the hospital to finally book him. While there, though, we inventoried his property, and the rookie officer, plain as day, and on camera finds the tiniest baggie of coke, waving it around for all to see, that we now have to deal with on top. Was not a fun day and felt super crappy almost from beginning to end. Story 61. Yes, there's times when people do things in the heat of the moment that they wouldn't normally do. For example, we had a domestic where the girlfriend smacked the crap out of her boyfriend because she found out he'd been cheating on her. Based on both their statements, it wasn't a physically abusive relationship. This lady didn't have so much as a traffic ticket on her record. In the heat of the moment, she just let him have it. Obviously, that's not a justification. It was still domestic violence, and she was arrested and charged for it. But I still couldn't help but feel kind of bad for her because she just made a really stupid decision while so amped up on emotion that she couldn't think rationally. Story 62. Wasn't my arrest, but I was involved in the proceedings after. A husband called the police on his wife, saying she was drinking/being combative. Deputies arrive at the home. She becomes combative and an arrest is made. She gets the chance to tell multiple people her side of the story. Judge, CPS, and deputies. She says she found out her husband was at a strip club and out drinking. He forbids her to drink, ever. It deeply upset her/hurt her feelings. She grabs a bottle of wine on the way home from work, gets home, is drinking the wine, and starts to cook dinner for the kids. They exchange words and he departs to another room. She says she's cooking, alone in the kitchen, when deputies show up. Admits to being very upset that they showed up and is arrested. A CPS case is open due to the drinking/arrest in the home. Long story short, he controls the money, their life, and anything that goes on in the home. If she goes against the grain, this is what happens. He might make her pay for it. This particular day, he called the police on her for drinking in her own home. It was sad and disturbing. She said she couldn't leave him because he was her financial provider. Everyone believed her afterwards. Story 63. All the time, even when they deserve it. It's human nature to be sympathetic, but some people, absolutely not. Mainly when they flee from me, are a-holes or offenders. I pulled over some guy driving a crap box a few weeks ago. Had a hunch it would be a good stop. Found a traffic infraction, of course, and stopped him for it. He was a really nice guy, but I saw a big fixed blade knife wedged between the seat and center console. He's a convicted felon, so I searched the car for more illegally possessed weapons and found several fixed blade knives, like daggers, which would serve no other purpose than being used as a weapon. Anyways, I arrested the guy for possession of a weapon by restricted person, a felony, and I actually felt bad for him and questioned whether or not I was doing the right thing because he was a genuinely nice guy, or so it seemed. He was crying in the back of my car because he knew he was likely going to go back to prison because of it. I'm a proactive cop and I like to build good cases, and I can't let a felony like that slide regardless. Also, he was convicted of manslaughter when he killed his wife, which is why he served time in prison. He claims to be innocent, and we spoke about it a lot on the way to jail. From what he told me, she unalived herself in front of him. But obviously, to be convicted, the jury has to find that beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant committed the crime. Who knows? Hope the best for him if he truly is innocent, but he knows he can't have weapons since he's a felon, so it's his own fault. Story 64. Back when I was very new on my own as an officer, I pulled over a guy who had a suspended license with extra stuff that made it an arrestable offense. Ran the name, everybody started chirping on the radio about how that guy was a definite issue a few years back, burglarizing cars, houses, etc. As other units started showing up to back me up, it got real obvious to me real quick that he was heading back to work from picking up a quick lunch. I still made that arrest, and a decade later still feel awful about it. I hope I've paid it forward somewhat through stressing making the right decision for the right reasons to a few generations of recruits as an FTO, and a few more officers as a sergeant. Story 65. I know, I'm not a cop. I had to do an internship in my hometown with the local PD for my bachelor's degree. It was pretty much ride-alongs for 90 days. One night, we were driving along and see a car pull a rolling stop at a sign. The officer pulls the car over and initiates the stop. We get out of the car and approach the vehicle. As soon as I see the driver, I know that everything is FUBAR. It's my friend's younger brother. He's like 22 or so. He admitted to having been drinking and fails the field sobriety test. He blew a .10 on the breathalyzer and she took him in. The guy was literally a block from his house. I know what he did was wrong, but I felt so bad for him. He didn't seem drunk and was totally cooperative. In the grand scheme of things, all that probably happens was he had one too many and headed home an hour or so too early. I was just an intern, so I couldn't convince the arresting officer to drop the charges. Technically, he had broken the law, so I stood outside smoking cigarettes with the guy until I had to go respond to another call with the officer I was assigned to. Story 66. I was a hospital security officer, and cops brought in a drunk guy that was causing a scene at the bar he was at. PD brought him to essentially sleep it off at the hospital, which is pretty common where I live. Anyways, he gets rowdy with the nurses, and they call security for us to watch him and make sure he doesn't leave with the IV in his arm and to strongly suggest that he sit tight and sleep it off. Anyways, he gets up, pushes past me and tries to leave, and I nicely assist him to the ground. I smacked his head against the gurney wheel and he kneed me in the ribs. My adrenaline and rage got the better of me when PD was called, as they always are when we get physical. I opted to press charges even though the guy didn't really have much coordination over what he was doing. He was belligerently drunk still. The next day, I got served to testify against him in court for assault, and he's clearly sober at this point, and he looks like he effed up. He apologizes, says he can't really remember clearly because he hit his head at the bar, and issues a written apology to the nurses and security staff in the bar where he was picked up. I walked. I couldn't go further with that and screw up his life even further. He gets a slap on the wrist and an order to undergo alcohol counseling. I've made my mistakes in my life, and I don't think people should be paying hefty prices for every one they make, especially if it's minor. I sound like the bad guy for keeping him at the hospital against his will, but trying to explain that we need to remove the IV in his arm before letting him go to a crap-faced man who didn't respond to anything wasn't exactly easy to do. Story 67. Not a cop, but as a teen, I helped do tobacco compliance checks. You pretty much got paid after training to go in with undercover cops and try to buy cigarettes underage. At one store, this guy was super nice. Started talking to me about his family, how his wife is going to be having their first baby soon, and how he's so happy they finally can because US citizens, etc. And then he sells me the cigarettes. You could see the crushed look on the guy's face when he was busted, like he lost faith in people that day. I felt like such a jerk, and to top it off, the cop I was with gave him a ticket because he had not even asked for my ID. Story 68. I frequently have to arrest people, mostly males, for domestic abuse. Sometimes the female claims injury, although there's no marks, and sometimes there's a small scratch or whatever that occurred during whatever happened. Most of the time I don't feel bad, as something obviously happened and I'm temporarily fixing the situation. However, a couple of times I've talked to the female and can tell she's batcrap crazy and is calling us for the wrong reasons. One time in particular, the female called and they were separated when I arrived. She just kept screaming at me that she wanted her husband arrested. I asked if she had any injury or complaint of pain and she said no. She kept insisting that I needed to arrest him. I told her that I wasn't arresting him unless there was an injury, and she looked me dead in the eye and told me if that was the case, her stomach hurt from where he punched her. I had no choice but to arrest him. Got him released with no bail, but I knew it was bullcrap and it screwed up his week for a while because he couldn't go home. I found out from him that they were going through some crap and she wanted a divorce, and kept calling the police to strengthen her case against him. It sucked. Story 69. Yes, I arrested a young man in his mid-20s for SA late last year, as the victim's story was very good and she was hitting all the right terms and verbiage. While interviewing the suspect in jail, the morning after he was arrested, his story, his body language, and his willing to agree to everything I asked told me this guy did not SA her. I left the jail and rushed to meet the victim and re-interviewed her. After 20 minutes of going over her story and his story and telling her we found video cameras all around the area, she broke down and said she lied to get attention. I rushed out of that room, called the DA who would review the case from my cell phone, spoke to her about the case and what I found, and asked for an immediate release of the suspect. By the time I got to my station, 15 minutes away, and to my desk, the DA had already faxed over a case reject sheet for me, and he was released within an hour of me leaving him. He was released pending any findings of the medical exam that was done on her. Forward 4 weeks after that day, and I get the medical exam results back, and it showed me that her exam found nothing. The guy that was arrested and his mother were very understanding of the whole incident and understood why things were done the way they were. I never said I was sorry for what I did, because based on the information we had at the time and story we had from the victim, all pointed to the elements of a SA. By the way, I have been an officer/detective for 25 plus years, and this one case hurts me the most. Side note, I asked if I could arrest her for making a false SA report and was denied as it would send the wrong message.